So in Marvel Comics, the Sentry is the only character that the Incredible Hulk is afraid of, but he's also ridiculously powerful, way more powerful than you think he is. And so much like we did with the X-Men's Krakoan Age, where we kind of ran over the entire series to give you an idea of what it was about, and then some little spots if you wanted to get into it, we're gonna do the same thing with the Sentry here. And it all really kicked off back in 2000 with the Paul Jenkins Jay Lee Sentry run. That's when he was originally introduced to Marvel Comics. And it's also the story that shows that Hulk is afraid of the Sentry, or what's called the Void. And we'll talk about that as we get through this part of the discussion. But originally when this comic was introduced, it was done in a way to trick the reader into believing that the Sentry was just like this long lost concept that had been created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby back in the 60s and was just never used. And that's why if you go through the story, you see these flashback moments where it looks like it was drawn the way comics were drawn in the 60s. But initially it started with this idea that like Robert Reynolds was just like some kind of schizophrenic, right? He wakes up in the middle of the night and he's screaming about how the Void is returned. There's a point where like his dog starts talking to him and tormenting him. There's apparently some kind of history of alcoholism in his life, and his wife Lindy ultimately ends up leaving him because she believes he's an alcoholic. But at the very end of the first issue, while it looks like he's insane because he takes these clothespins and attaches a cape to his back, he actually starts flying through the air. And that's when you find out like it's real. This guy is actually a superhero. And so after that, he goes to see the Fantastic Four because Robert Reynolds and Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four were both like incredibly good friends. But for some reason that's not initially explained, Reed Richards does not know who Robert Reynolds is. But the whole conversation plays out in a way to where the Sentry knows why Reed Richards doesn't remember him. He doesn't tell Reed Richards what the reason is, and Reed himself kind of comments about how like the memory is on the edge of his mind, but for some reason he's not allowed to remember it. And so the same thing happens when the Sentry goes to see Spider-Man and Professor Xavier of the X-Men and Doctor Strange, and of course wrapping back around to the Incredible Hulk, who's like the only one not affected. And over the course of the comic, you also end up learning that the Sentry was the precursor to all the superheroes that exist out there. He's the reason why Spider-Man and Doctor Strange and all these guys ended up becoming superheroes in the first place. They were inspired by the Sentry's antics and what he stood for, which in a lot of ways was very much designed to position the Sentry originally as kind of like Marvel's answer to Superman, or one of the many answers they have. They also have the Hyperion, Blue Marvel loosely, Gladiator, so on and so forth. But what you end up learning is that the arch nemesis of the Sentry is a guy called the Void. And the Void was kind of like the old school villain. Eventually the Sentry quote unquote catches up to the Void and seemingly the Void is destroyed. But the way it played out in the old stories is that the Sentry and all the other superheroes always showed up after the Void had already struck. And so because of everything that's going on, the Sentry returns back to what's called Sentry Tower or Sentry City, whatever you want to call it. And so what this does is it all kind of comes to a head in two forms. The first one is the Sentry actually going to this kind of watchtower that he has that actually sits on top of Avengers Tower. And you end up learning that there's a device up there that emits a kind of pulse across the world that blocks everybody's knowledge of the Sentry. The device is turned off, and that's when the Void returns, because the Void is the other half of the Sentry. And so long as the world remembers who the Sentry is, the Void will always be able to manifest. And so you have this kind of coming together of all these different superheroes alongside the Sentry to deal with the Void, who manifests as its own separate entity. But in order to kind of save the world, the device is turned back on, and the world forgets about the Sentry again. And it was designed to be a one-off. It was a beautifully written and drawn story. It was phenomenal, but it was designed to be a one-off, and that was really it. But then you go into New Avengers, and New Avengers, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with it, was basically the follow-up to the original Avengers comic, where that team disbanded during what was called Avengers Disassembled. New Avengers was launched to take its place. Spider-Man, Captain America, Iron Man, Wolverine, these guys all on a singular team. It was cool. But the first story arc kind of reintroduces the Sentry to the reader, and the second story arc explores it. And that's when you learn how powerful he is, in the sense that the first arc is called Breakout. Basically like powers taken down to the supervillain prison called the Raft, all these different villains escape, but the Sentry's there. And the Sentry initially chooses not to leave because of how dangerous he is. You don't really know how he's there, why he's there. It's really wonky when Marvel tries to explain it. There is this point where he takes Carnage, I think it is, into space and like tears him in half in this really iconic scene that I'm sure you've seen across the internet. But in the second volume called Who is the Sentry, the Void manifests. And when that happens, there's a point in the story where the X-Men, New Avengers, the Fantastic Four, they all come together to try to stop the Void, and there's nothing they can do. right? Like the Void overpowers all of them. And that was like the first real moment when you realized, holy cow, like this guy's next level. Like he could destroy them all if he wanted to. And so what you have is Emma Frost of the X-Men, one of the most powerful telepaths in Marvel Comics, that goes into the mind of Robert Reynolds. And it's just really strange the way that Brian Michael Bendis handled it. But in effect, the way that it was done is it was designed to say that the original Sentry story that we had read was just kind of like this manifested story created by Robert Reynolds. Because as the Sentry, he had the ability to alter reality. And so he just like fabricated his own original origin story, and then that's it, right? Again, it's very hand-wavy, it was very poorly done, truth to tell, but the meaningful result of this was that the Sentry was officially brought in to the main Marvel universe, and it created this idea that the Sentry was always trying to keep the Void from manifesting, and there was seemingly no way to know when it was going to happen, so he was always fighting this kind of mental battle. What's so crazy about it is, despite how interesting the Sentry was, when he was brought in, none of it ever mattered. Because by and large, his character was just largely wasted. There were some really, really cool stories. Of course, World War Hulk is the most notable, but there were some that led up to it. But there were just so many inconsistencies. Like there's a point in Marvel's Civil War when like Wolverine overpowers the Sentry, which just didn't make any sense given the fact that the Sentry was supposed to be so incredibly powerful. Loosely able to alter reality, he was every bit as capable and strong as Superman was. He should have just been able to like grab Wolverine, fly him to Saturn and drop him off. And like that would have been it, right? Wolverine never would have appeared in Marvel Comics again. But the bigger thing is you go into like the World War Hulk event. And that's where I think most people know the Sentry as a character. And for those of you guys who don't, the cool thing about this was that while the World War Hulk event did have the Sentry fighting the Incredible Hulk, if you were reading Marvel consistently at the time, specifically the Mighty Avengers, which was basically a kind of spin-off Avengers team during Marvel's Civil War, that the Sentry just never really had an instance to cut loose, right? To really just flex his strength. And so over time, once you got into World War Hulk, the Incredible Hulk came back, he imprisoned the Illuminati, basically waged war against the world, for lack of a better term. The Sentry was seemingly the only guy that could bring him down. And so the Sentry comes flying in, and the two of them just start going at it. I mean, just absolutely pummeling each other to the point that they actually fight to a standstill. But one of the comments the Sentry makes over the course of that is it feels so good to let loose because the Incredible Hulk is the only one who can handle it. It was also really cool because it gave us a kind of indirect comparison to just how powerful the Sentry was. That World War Hulk, World Breaker Hulk, if you want to call him that, was basically the Incredible Hulk at his strongest at that point in time. The fact that Sentry was able to fight him toe to toe really gave us perspective in terms of what he was capable of. But then like after World War Hulk, things just kind of died down. And then you went into Siege on Asgard. And Siege on Asgard was kind of like the big Sentry moment because not only did it give us Sentry as kind of a bad guy, if you wanted to call him that, there's actually a what if story in Marvel Comics that shows what the Sentry could do if he full on gave into the Void and lost it. And so the way it played out in Siege on Asgard is this was the ending to a branding initiative called Dark Reign. Dark Reign wasn't really a story. It wasn't like Civil War where you had like Dark Reign parts 1, 2, 3, and 4. It was basically like, what if all the superheroes quit and all these villains who were similar to the superheroes replaced them? So Norman Osborn ends up replacing Iron Man, Wolverine's son Daken replaces Wolverine, so on and so forth. And so the Sentry ended up joining the side of Norman Osborn. And one of the last holdouts, with Norman Osborn trying to seize control of the United States, was Asgard, which had been placed in Broxton, Oklahoma, following Thor's return after his death and Thor disassembled. And so the story itself is literally the event, right? A siege on Asgard by Norman Osborn and all his forces. There's a what if story where the Sentry gives in to the Void, and the Void kills all the superheroes on the spot and then leaves Earth to conquer the rest of the universe. And the story ended in such a way where we as the reader were led to believe that because of the fact that the Void represents all of the Sentry's power with none of the Sentry's moral compass, because of his extreme ability to alter reality, he would have killed everything in the Marvel universe, and that would have been it. Again, it wasn't necessarily definitive. It was just kind of like, then the Sentry goes into space, ... you know what happens next, like that kind of thing. But if you're interested in reading the Sentry in Marvel Comics, we've covered pretty much all the stories that he's in. And if we haven't already, we'll make a playlist that you can just watch. But if you want to go out and actually get those stories, definitely start with Paul Jenkins and Jay Lee's The Sentry, right? That's the best Sentry story in Marvel Comics. And it is standalone. So you could read that and then never read The Sentry again and be perfectly fine, right? It's a phenomenal story. After that, you go into New Avengers Volume 1 Breakout, and then you go into New Avengers Volume 2, who is the Sentry, and then just kind of like we talked about here, you just sort of pick your poison. You can go read World War Hulk, and then of course see the fight between Hulk and the Sentry. There is Annihilation Scourge, which is a cool story where the Sentry is in the negative zone, and it's just kind of like the Void as opposed to the Sentry, but he's like laying waste to, I wouldn't say whole universes, but it shows how dangerous the Void can be. There is also a single Sentry series by Jeff Lemire, I think it is, where the Sentry kind of merges with the Void and they become one single composite being. I didn't really talk about that here because the story never really went anywhere. Technically it segues into Annihilation Scourge, but Marvel didn't know what they wanted to do with it. So it's a cool little point in its history, but nothing ever comes of it, and it doesn't really matter all that much. There is Sentry World, which was a story arc that focused on the Sentry kind of going into a pocket dimension in his own mind that was created by Doctor Strange, where he could really just be his own character, do his own thing, and allow his powers to run rampant without ever having to worry about the Void manifesting in the real world. But again, you know, he's one of these guys where he was introduced in Marvel in the early 2000s, and then as part of Bendis's run on New Avengers, he showed up in a few comics here and there, and then that was really it. Marvel just never really knew what to do with this character. So with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Let me know what you think down in the comment section, and I will catch you all later. Peace.